I was talking to my neighbor Fred the other day, who originally voted for Trump, and he's now starting to regret it a little bit. You see, Fred has a job in research funded by USAID. For the past 4 years, he's been the project manager of a government research project, which is unfortunately or fortunately getting cut. He's very upset and he's disappointed in having his analyst group shut down. His group was examining if the wheels on a bus go round and round. But what bothered Fred even more was that now the American people will probably never know the answer to that. Poor Fred. Yeah. So tonight we have newly elected district chair Deb Ostrike here, and she's awesome. So she's going to come up and talk for just a few minutes about her plans and the executive board's plans for the 11th congressional district. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Deb Ostrike.
For voting for me, if you voted for me. Yay! We have a lot of work, whether you're in the 11th district or anywhere else. We have a lot of work in Michigan coming up. Our executive committee will be meeting in a private session next week, and we will be defining the groundwork and the framework that it will take to build over the next 2 years, not only for our local elections, but for our state races coming up. So even if you are not on our executive committee, we need all the hands on deck. We need boots on the ground. So we'll be presenting all of these findings at our April meeting. We'll let you know, emails will go out, so we'll get all that information to you as soon as we have it all ready to go. But again, we're meeting on the 18th in a private session just to review everything and to lay the framework. Okay? Anybody have any questions for me?
Do you know where that meeting will be?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not in April.
Okay.
We're looking at various locations, so just be on the lookout for an email. It'll be coming from the 11th district. All right? Have a great evening.
So here's a little service announcement. The Walled Lake Citizens for Parental Choice is hosting a St. Patrick's Day party, and it's at my house. Don't ask me how that happened, but anyway, so if you have children or grandchildren, or you're just basically interested in helping out one of the largest school districts in Michigan find its way back to sanity, you might want to attend and just learn a little bit about what the Walled Lake Citizens for Parental Rights does, while also having a good time. It is March 22nd, 7 p.m., and I'll send out my address. Is that up here? Oh, Vince, can you see if we can get to that one? Keep going. There. Okay. And it's a potluck. So they're asking, anybody can take a picture of this QR code or wait for my email. They'd like an RSVP because I'm sure they're providing a lot of additional food and beverage. So if you can RSVP by March 15th through the QR code, and like I say, a reminder email will be sent out. So I really kind of feel a kinship to our next guest. Accused of crimes related to January 6, 2021, the events that were at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Jeremy Rogers was found guilty of all charges December 12, 2024 in federal court. Jeremy was to be sentenced February 21st of this year, and his fate has hung in limbo, just as it has for the past 4 years. Following his inauguration on January 20th, President Trump issued full commutations and pardons for those indicted and/or sentenced in relations to the events at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Tonight, we have Jeremy Rogers joining us to talk about what he experienced, what that experience was like for the past 4 years. and described what it was like to be pardoned by President Trump. He and 15 others participants received that news just a few weeks ago. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Jeremy Rogers.
But thank you, Marion, for having me this evening and inviting me to join you. It was our hope. I have two other acquaintances that are also January 6th defendants, both of whom have been pardoned, that I had hoped to be able to bring with me tonight so that we could have a panel of us. Unfortunately, neither of them were able to make it. They had other commitments, but I want to thank you all, the Lakes Area Tea Party, for having me tonight. I also want to start by saying thank you to God for sparing President Trump's life on July 13th last year. And I would certainly be remiss if I did not thank President Trump for pardoning me, along with all of the other January 6th defendants, in righting this injustice. So I wanted to start this evening and just give you a brief background on myself. My name, as Marion said, is Jeremy Rogers. My background has been in political work. I have 2 children, and I was married in 2019. Unfortunately, I am in the process of getting divorced, largely as a result of the chaos of the past 4 years. I attended Central Michigan University and graduated in 2017 with a degree in history and a minor in political science. In 2014, I was given the opportunity while still in college to be campaign manager for former state representative Gary Glenn. Some of you may recognize that name. He was a fantastic legislator for us from Midland, which is where I'm from. Unfortunately, Gary passed away just, I believe, a year and a half ago. So not last year, but in 2023. In addition to working for Gary Glenn when he was running for the State House in 2014, I stayed active with my local party in Midland County, the Midland County Republican Party. And during my time in college at CMU, I also tried to join the Army National Guard, and unfortunately that happened to be at the tail end of the Obama administration, and due to the military sequester at the time, I was turned away for medical reasons. So I was not able to join, although that was something that I was very passionate about trying to do. Right after I graduated college, I was offered a job working on Bill Schuette's campaign when he ran for governor in 2018. And following Attorney General Schuette's defeat in that election, I was offered a job working full-time in the state legislature for my state senator and chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Senator Jim Stamas. He has since been turned out. In 2020, I was also elected as a national delegate, and I have been a longtime precinct delegate and activist. So I share all of that with you, and I'm sorry, this mic is a little sensitive, I think. I maybe need to hold it further away. I share that with you not to pat myself on the back, but to try to convey to you that I love my country, and I have sought to serve my community, my state, and our great country in whatever way I can. And I'm certainly not what the radical Biden administration and their weaponized FBI and DOJ tried to label me, which was a domestic terrorist. They also claimed that I, along with all the other January 6th defendants, were a threat to democracy. The real threat to democracy is the weaponization of our democratic institutions to intimidate, persecute, and silence political opposition. Marion, I think you know a little bit about that. So, hopefully that background gives you a little bit of context about my past and my experience, and it also hopefully will lend some insight to you as to why I felt when I found out that Trump was holding a rally on January 6th after the November election of 2020, that I needed to be there to support the president. My January 6th story, though, starts in early November of 2020, waking up after election night, thinking when I had gone to bed that we had won, and waking up to find out that we had not won. I was frustrated, I was disappointed, and I do believe, and I still believe, that the 2020 election was stolen. And we could debate with many of our friends and neighbors, I'm sure, about fraudulent ballots and dead people voting and go into the weeds on all of those topics. But to me, it was a really simple argument. The United States Constitution was violated in the 2020 election. Article 1, Section 4 gives state legislatures the authority to determine the rules for federal elections in their state. And our state, along with many of the critical swing states that we ended up losing, had governors or secretaries of state unilaterally bypass their state legislatures and change their election laws, using COVID as an excuse to do so. And I did not want to stand by and see that stand. So when I heard that Trump was holding a rally in DC on January 6th, I thought that it was my patriotic duty to stand up for what I believed to be the truth and support the rightful president of the United States. So I traveled to Washington, D.C., or that area, I should say, on January 5th with a couple of friends from the area where I live, Midland County, and one of them was from the Thumb as well. We traveled together to the D.C. area, got a hotel, spent the night in our hotel the night before, and got up early, took the metro into D.C., and even though we had left pretty early, by the time we got to the Ellipse, there were already hundreds of thousands of people there. I have never seen a crowd as large as I did that day in DC. And I think it's interesting. I've seen reports and newspapers and media talk about how, well, there was maybe 50,000 people present there. Well, I used this cool little app called Google Earth and drew a box around the Washington Monument and the Ellipse and calculated, it will calculate for you how many acres are within that area. And essentially from the Ellipse all the way to the Washington Monument to both of the side streets was packed with people. And according to ChatGPT, calculating an estimate of how many people could fit in I think it was approximately 41 acres, it estimated maybe 750,000 to 800,000 people. So I bet you that there were over 1 million Trump supporters in DC that day, and I was proud to be one of them. So the events of that day unfolded as we got there. We really didn't get to be as close to Trump as we wanted. We were quite a ways back. There were just too many people to try to force your way up closer to the front. The friends that I went with, we have a mutual hobby that we enjoy, and that is occasionally smoking cigars together. So we had brought some cigars with us, and as Trump was speaking, we couldn't really see him. We could still hear him, but we decided to make our way to the edge of the crowd to smoke the cigars that we had brought with us, so that we wouldn't bother everybody else that was there, as they were packed together like sardines. So we made our way to the edge of the lawn that surrounds the Washington Monument, closest to the Capitol building. And as we were sitting there talking and also still listening to Trump's speech, smoking our cigars, a gentleman was working that entire side of the street, the entire side of the crowd. I didn't know it at the time, but he also approached us, and I didn't know his identity at the time, but found out later that the guy that was talking to us and telling us, hey, Trump is going to be speaking at the Capitol building next. You need to start heading that way now, was none other than Ray Epps. So, we did not have a good position at the rally at the Ellipse, so we decided, okay, if Trump is going to be speaking at the Capitol building next, we'll make our way there, and if we leave now, maybe we can be closer to the president when he arrives there to speak. So we made our way to the Capitol building, and in retrospect, it was interesting. I do remember it coming up in our conversation as we made our way to the Capitol building. There was very, very little police presence. In fact, I think on the side of the Capitol building nearest the Washington Monument, we encountered 2 officers. And we were actually looking for some officers because we needed to use the restroom and we could not find one. And so we asked the 2 officers that we did see near the Capitol building where the nearest restroom was. They directed us a short distance away. So we went and used the restroom, got some coffee, and then came back to the Capitol building. But instead of going to what I think is the west side, closest to the Washington Monument, we made our way to the east side, which is nearest the Supreme Court building and the Library of Congress. There were fewer people on that side, but by the time we got back from using the restroom, there was still quite a sizable crowd that had gathered on that side. And as we stood there for the next, it's difficult to say exactly how long, maybe an hour, the atmosphere was very positive. People were excited to be there and optimistic that Trump was going to be able to prove that this election was stolen. We thought that there was a good chance that some of the state's election results would not be certified that day. We knew that there were Republicans that were going to be objecting to certain states' election results. Certainly no indication that this was a rough or violent crowd. I saw many grandmothers and grandfathers and parents even with their children there that day. It was a very peaceful, patriotic crowd. I don't believe at that time Trump had finished speaking yet, but shortly after we'd gotten there, so maybe an hour after we'd arrived on that side of the building, we could hear some commotion from the other side of the building, but weren't really sure what was going on. And essentially a few minutes later, a large crowd made its way around the Capitol building to our side. And so a bunch of the people, most of the people on that side of the building joined them. And we marched up to the steps of the Capitol building. And it is our building, by the way. And if the First Amendment does not apply on the grounds of the U.S. Capitol building, or in the building for that matter, do you actually have a First Amendment right to speak or to protest? If the government can tell you no, you can't do that, I think that there's a case to be made that that's problematic. So we joined with that crowd and made our way up the stairs. There were some officers present. The group that I was with was not engaging with officers in any way, and primarily what happened was, as people were moving in towards those steps, people behind them, as happens sometimes with the crowd, were putting pressure on the people in front of them and kind of pushing people up those steps. There was very little, probably no violence that was taking place at that time, but the police were just, maybe 10, 12 of them, were just kind of backing up the stairs and eventually just worked their way up to a position right next to the Columbus doors on the Capitol building. They just stood there. We just stood there on the porch, or I guess it's a porch, of the Capitol building. And people were singing the national anthem. There were people praying. It was a very friendly environment at that time. I know that I saw people shaking hands with officers and thanking them for their service. And eventually, at some point, somebody opened the doors, those Columbus doors, from the inside. And I know this now, having gone to trial and having seen the video footage. It appears to have been another protester because there were already people inside the Capitol building at that time. So those doors were opened, but it is interesting to note that those are magnetically locked doors. And it's my understanding, although I'm not an expert on the matter, that those are the same kinds of doors that are magnetically sealed that are on U.S. embassies. So those doors do not open unless somebody allows them to be opened. So at some point those doors were opened, and I was on the porch near those doors and did actually enter the Capitol building. I did not think that that was something that I should not do. I had worked, as I said earlier, in the Michigan Capitol building, and that's open to the public during normal business hours with no security. There is a desk in the Capitol building in Lansing with a couple of state troopers. They wave at you as you walk in, and you can pretty much go anywhere in the Michigan Capitol building, except for you cannot go on the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate without permission. So in my mind, I was doing absolutely nothing wrong. I was there to support President Trump, to peacefully protest, and as I walked in, I know that I distinctly recall a moment where somebody broke something, and it sounded like glass, but I couldn't see it. There were a lot of people in the rotunda, and unanimously, the Trump supporters that were there condemned that immediately. They said, no, don't break anything. So I then proceeded into Statuary Hall. At that time I was not really familiar with where I was in the building. I did recognize Statuary Hall, but I wasn't sure what level of the Capitol building we were on. If I had gone down the hallway and through the doors at the end of the hallway, I wasn't sure if that was the House floor or if it was the gallery, but I did recognize Statuary Hall. And being a history major, I love history, and I know that I believe one of our former senators from Michigan actually has a statue in Statuary Hall, Lewis Cass. And so I'm actually on tape saying, as I'm walking through Statuary Hall, do not deface the statues or the building. So I clearly had no indication to commit any acts of violence. I basically walked through the Capitol building a couple of times. You know, the federal government said I paraded. I guess that's maybe accurate, but walked back and forth a couple of times, and the first time I was told that I was not allowed to be there and was asked to leave by a Capitol Police officer, I did so. So we left the Capitol building after I exited the Capitol building, went back to our hotel, went to bed, woke up the next morning to news coverage saying that there was an insurrection, and we were flabbergasted. We drove home, and I didn't really think anything of anything that I had done that day was illegal or wrong. I thought that I was acting within my constitutional rights. We drove home. News coverage, continued of the events of that day. And ultimately I just thought, this is being greatly exaggerated by the media. I did see some of the clips that they were showing, and they were edited clips. They were only showing like the absolute worst behavior of what had happened that day. I was a little bit concerned that maybe something was going to come from this for me, because I did see shortly after the events of that day that Merrick Garland had said that they were responding to the protesters with shock and awe. And I did see that over the days following, more and more people were being arrested. And I wondered if maybe that would happen to me. I wasn't sure. I didn't think I had done anything wrong. Well, in April or May of 2021, I found out that I was on the FBI wanted list. It wasn't my name, but there were some photos of me on their page. So I freaked out, to put it bluntly. And I was not sure what to do. That's shocking news. Never anticipated that in my life I would see a photo of me on the FBI's most wanted page. So a month later perhaps, had a friend that was an attorney, and I did talk to him. He's a criminal defense attorney from Bay City, Michigan. I had spoken with him, and I told him, I'm like, I don't believe that I did anything wrong. Should I turn myself in? And his advice to me was absolutely not. Do not turn yourself in. You are going to be found guilty of something if you do that. He said your best bet is to continue living life as best you can, keep your head down, and just hope that nobody identifies you and turns you in or reports you and nothing comes of this. That is a lot easier to say than to do. It's really difficult living with that hanging over your head and waking up every morning and wondering, am I going to get a visit from the FBI today? But I managed to continue living life somewhat normally and continued working. So I found out I was on that list in April or May of 2021. In January of 2022, I found out that my aunt and uncle had turned me in. And the way that I found out they turned me in was not only had they turned me in, but they were anonymously calling local media and reporting that I was there to local media. The long story short of how I figured out that they were the ones making these calls is there was an acquaintance of mine that worked, I mentioned an attorney that I'd spoken with. An acquaintance of mine worked at that law office of that attorney, and he had started within the past 2 years at that time an online publication called the Chemical City Paper. And my aunt and uncle called the law office to leave a news tip for this acquaintance of mine. So of course my attorney, who I've already discussed the fact that I was on the watch list or the wanted list with him, of course handed me the message and said, hey, it doesn't say who they are, but here's the phone number and here's what was said. And I immediately thought I recognized the number and plugged it into my phone, and sure enough, it was my uncle. So as you can imagine, this was a roller coaster of emotions. Some days were better than others. Sorry, I keep saying
It's okay. Be with friends.
So when that happened, I was serving on the Planning Commission for the City of Midland. And technically, I guess that would make me a public figure. And I was concerned because I knew that the Midland Daily News, the other paper in town, had also been contacted. They cover the Planning Commission. So I decided that I needed to resign. And the Midland Daily News did attempt to contact me, and I told them that I had resigned from the Planning Commission, that I was a private citizen, and I did not talk to the media. They continued to pester me for weeks following that, and I just ignored them. So, months went by. Nothing happened, nothing came of this, no stories were written. I think because I wasn't talking to the media, they didn't have a story at that time to write. Until December of 2022, I was working as an insurance agent at a local independent insurance agency, and I had 2 FBI agents show up to my office, even though my house was less than a quarter mile down the road from my office, and had they wished to do so, they could have easily met with me there. But of course, their intention is to try to get you fired from your job. And unfortunately, they succeeded, even though when I went upstairs in our office and met with them, I just told them that, gentlemen, I appreciate you have a job to do. I'm not comfortable answering any questions without my attorney present. And by the way, I don't care for what reason the FBI gives you. If they ask to interview you, you do not talk to the FBI. If you say one wrong thing or omit a detail, even accidentally, that is a felony. It's called lying to the FBI. So they thanked me, gave me a business card, and asked me to have an attorney contact them. I called the same attorney from Bay City that I had previously spoken with and told him what had happened, and he, that same day, called them and left a voicemail. 2 days later, I was fired from my job, and another 2 days after that, my attorney called me back and said I have not heard anything in 4 days after leaving a message for the FBI. So he said, I'm going to send them an email to make sure that there's a paper trail. He sent that email the week before Christmas, and we heard absolutely nothing. So I lost my job. I was offered an opportunity to work with my father, who lives in Florida. So I went down to Florida and was traveling back and forth. Went down to Florida and was working with my father, and 6 months later, in June of 2023, my wife called me and told me that the FBI, about a dozen agents, along with some local law enforcement as well, had executed a no-knock raid on my house at 6 in the morning. They literally bashed in our front door and escorted at the time, my boys were 2 and 3 years old. They were in their pajamas and escorted my wife and my children out of our house at rifle point while I was not there. And then they searched our house. That's the term they used. In reality, they trashed our house. They turned it upside down. They even took an American flag that I had hanging on a hanger in my closet and tossed it aside. Very disrespectful. They broke my kids' toys because, as you can imagine, young boys kind of have toys all over the floor, and they didn't bother to be respectful and move things out of the way. They just walked where they wanted to and destroyed some toys. And the search warrant stated that they were searching for blueprints and schematics of the Capitol building. So the next day, I was asked to turn myself in, which I did in Orlando. So I turned myself into the Orlando field office and was arrested and processed, taken to the courthouse in Orlando, and released, thankfully, later that day on my own recognizance, so I didn't have to put up bail, and traveled back home a few days later to Michigan and sat in my house for about 5 weeks, and I think I left once. It's really hard to put into words what it feels like to have the full weight of the federal government coming down on you. I had, over the last 2 years since my arrest in June of 2023, I had 5 different jobs. And it's very discouraging. Sometimes you wonder why even bother with getting up in the morning and going to work. For what? Your entire life is on hold. It's impossible to plan for the future. You're just living day to day. And it went on like that for a year and a half, approximately. I originally was indicted on 5 felony counts and 3 misdemeanor counts. And then 2 months later, they added a 6th felony, which was, as you have probably heard, the obstruction of Congress charge, or a 1512 charge. Thankfully, that was later tossed by the United States Supreme Court. But facing 6 felony charges and 3 misdemeanor charges, I did hire an attorney that was one of the defense attorneys for Kyle Rittenhouse. His name was John Pierce. And in conversations with him and another attorney that was on his team, we concluded that really the only legal strategy we had was delay, delay, delay. At that point, Trump had announced he was running for president, and me in particular, I was praying and hoping that Trump was going to win that election. And we felt confident that we could delay trial until at least somewhat close to the election. There is more detail that I could give as to the specific charges, but I'm running out of time. Essentially, the main charge that they levied against me was an assault charge. They claimed that I had assaulted a federal officer with a dangerous or deadly weapon, and that weapon was my flagpole with a Trump flag on it. Because the Supreme Court had taken up the Fisher case, which was the case regarding the 1512 obstruction of Congress charge, we were able to delay my trial from May of 2024 until the end of September of 2024. We also then were able to secure a second delay to December 10th of 2024. In the meantime, they had added another component of the assault charge. They claimed that I had injured this police officer in addition to assaulting him. So we were pretty confident we could prove that I had not assaulted this officer and that I certainly had not injured him. And we thought we could do that because this officer had done 5 interviews with the FBI. And in his first 4 interviews, he was asked if anybody had injured him on January 6th. And he talked about several other defendants, but never once mentioned any interaction with me. And in that 4th interview that he did with the FBI, they even had showed him the clip of where they claimed I had assaulted him and asked him, was this painful? And the reason they had asked about pain was the statute that defines bodily injury essentially says that if you cause an officer any amount of pain for any length of time, that constitutes bodily injury. The officer's answer to if I had caused him pain in that 4th interview was no. They did a 5th and final interview with this officer 2 months after the Supreme Court had thrown out the obstruction of Congress charge. And for the first time ever, 3.5 years after the events of that day, the officer changed his story and said, yes, I was injured, I was hurt, it was painful. So we went to trial on December 10th and pointed all of this out to the judge in our cross-examination, and we thought we had at least secured a win on this assault charge, that there was no way that the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that I had assaulted this officer and injured him. Well, after 2 days of trial, on the 3rd day, the judge came back, and he was a Trump-appointed judge, by the way, came back and he said, well, I don't believe you used the flagpole as a dangerous or deadly weapon, but I found the officer's testimony to be credible, that it was painful. And so he found me guilty of the assault charge. I expected to be taken into custody that day. Typically, that's what would have happened. But thankfully, we had secured enough delays that the election had taken place, and we knew Trump had won. And Trump had promised that he was going to do something for January 6th defendants. We didn't know exactly what that would be. So the judge refused to have me detained, although the prosecution was seeking detention. And I was thankfully allowed to go home. And it's interesting, I am a Christian, I'm a born-again believer. And I know that numbers have great significance in Scripture. And it was interesting to me to note that from the day my trial started, on December 10th, to Inauguration Day, was 41 days. So 40 days is the number in Scripture associated with trial. It's the number of days that Christ was tempted by Satan. It's the number of years that the children of Israel wandered the desert. And I believe, it is the number of days and nights that Noah and his family were aboard the ark. So day 41 came, Inauguration Day, and I was pardoned by President Trump, and I'm very grateful for that. But those 40 days were extremely difficult. The not knowing what was going to happen and wondering if I would be going to prison on February 28th. February 28th was my actual sentencing day. So just 10 days ago, had Trump not pardoned me, I would have gone to sentencing in D.C. and likely been taken to the D.C. Gulag 10 days ago and would currently be in prison. So that's my story up until this point. And for the last 6 weeks or so now, I've been actively applying for jobs and trying to figure out what's next. Thankfully, because the pardon came before my sentencing hearing, I do not have a conviction on my permanent record. So I'm thankful for that. What I think I would like to leave as a last thought with you is we have to make sure that this sort of weaponization of the justice system cannot happen again. And we have to hold our elected officials accountable. Judges can be impeached, but Congress rarely uses that power. And I think that there's a case to be made that many of the judges that oversaw these cases should have been impeached because of how they handled these trials. In some instances, they refused to allow defendants to even mention the First Amendment as part of their defense. Right. So we have to stay engaged, we have to stay active, and we can't let our elected officials off the hook simply because we know them and they're our friends and we think they're nice people. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Marion, for having me. And God bless you, God bless the United States, and God bless President Trump. And fight, fight, fight.